All right, these are our notes on judicial review. This first slide you've already seen in an earlier assignment, but just to give a quick idea of judicial review, it's just what it sounds like. Judicial is the judicial branch reviewing a case to see if it's constitutional. It doesn't come from the actual Constitution. It comes from an implied power. It's something the Supreme Court took for itself in the famous case Marbury versus Madison. Here is a slide going over the details of Marbury versus Madison. We've already done an assignment on this, so I won't spend any more time. But just remember that the key thing with Marbury versus Madison is the Supreme Court ruled that it could declare a law unconstitutional. So here's the first case using judicial review after Marbury versus Madison, and that's the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. It dealt with a Missouri slave who was suing for his freedom because he had moved to a slave state with his master. This took place in the old courthouse in downtown St. Louis. If you've ever been up in the Arch, you've seen that building right out in front of you. One thing we need to learn from this case is that the Supreme Court often doesn't make a decision in a case that is straightforward. Here, abolitionists were trying to end slavery through the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did not rule on slavery. They ruled on the Missouri Compromise. The Supreme Court ruled that a national law creating slave and free states was unconstitutional because you were taking away a citizen's right to property. This is important because what we'll notice in the rest of these cases is the Supreme Court often looks at, is the citizen being wronged? And if they are going to win the case. And it doesn't matter if it's a national, state, or local law. If a citizen's rights to life, liberty, and property are being violated, they will win. Our next case is the case of Lochner versus New York. This is a case from the progressive era in U.S. history, which, if you remember from your history class, was when the government started looking out for the people and making their lives better. They started passing laws against child labor and protecting foods and drugs and making sure they were healthy and all of that. What this case is the state of New York was looking out for the people's right to life. They wanted to keep their citizens alive, but this baker, Mr. Lochner, wanted his right to property. He wanted to work as much as possible to make money for his family. So the case goes to the Supreme Court, and what the Supreme Court decides is that it rules the state of New York's law restricting the hours a baker could work unconstitutional, because once again, the citizens' rights will win out over the state's if they feel it is taking away their right to life, liberty, and property, which here it was. So even if a law is doing good, the Supreme Court can rule it unconstitutional if it takes away your rights. The next case is the case of Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. This was the case of a young girl named Linda Brown who was African American, and she wanted to go to the white school right across the road from her home. Because of the segregation policies at the time, she was forced to be bused outside of the city to the African American school that was of lesser quality. However, because of the Supreme Court case from the 1800s called Plessy versus Ferguson, it was ruled that so long as things were separate but equal, segregation could occur. Separate but equal really just said so long as the black school had books, a teacher, a building, it was equal to the white school, although the observer would notice that it was not. Linda Brown sued and said segregation was wrong, and the Supreme Court agreed with her. And what this shows us is that the Supreme Court can not only rule national and state laws unconstitutional, but they can also rule their previous decisions unconstitutional. And so now we look at the case of Roe versus Wade. This is a famous case and very much one people care about today as it deals with abortion. And in Roe versus Wade, what you had was state laws banned abortion. A woman wanted an abortion. She was not allowed to have that right. And so she sued and said that it was taking away her right to privacy. The state was saying that they were protecting the baby's right to life. It went to the Supreme Court, and as we said in Dred Scott versus Sanford, they don't always base their decision on the actual issue, but what the Constitution says. And here they looked at the idea of citizenship. The Constitution says nothing of abortion, but it does talk of citizenship, saying in the 14th Amendment that anyone born in our country or to American parents is a U.S. citizen. However, the baby has not been born yet here, so its right to life is less important than the mother's right to privacy. Hence why the Supreme Court ruled that abortion was legal in our country and these state laws were unconstitutional. This is just a very interesting case in that for something that so many people stick with religion in our country, it actually came down to citizenship with the Supreme Court. Our final case is Texas versus Johnson. I remember this case from when I was in middle school, and it was a major case that people were very fired up about. In this case, there was a man who wanted to protest our president at the time, President Reagan's policies, and to do so, he took an American flag and burnt it on the courthouse steps in his town. People were very upset by this. He was arrested, as 48 of our 50 states had laws that said you could not burn the American flag. He took it to the Supreme Court and said this was a violation of his First Amendment right to freedom of speech, as this was symbolic speech, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, as the citizens' right to free speech here outweighed the state's right to patriotism. And this just goes to show once again how the Supreme Court will rule in favor of the citizens' right to life, liberty, and property if those rights are violated by a national, state, or Supreme Court decision. And so those were cases that dealt specifically with judicial review. Now here are some cases that are important in our nation's history. This first case is called McCullough versus Maryland. Its importance is in that the national government told the state governments it didn't have to follow their rules. You can read the details in the slide. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with the national government because the Constitution says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Therefore, the supremacy clause of the Constitution states that the national government's laws will always reign supreme over the state government's laws. So McCullough versus Maryland strengthened the idea that our national government was stronger than the state governments. What it in effect did is it showed that we were not living under the Articles of Confederation anymore. We were living under the Constitution. This decision has carried forth with many different decisions where the national government and state governments collide, and the national government always reigns supreme. Here are the cases we had earlier on Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education. Just some more statistics for you to look at, but these are two cases that always show up at the end of the year on test, so we wanted to make sure that you know how important they are. The next case here is Engel versus Vitale. It is an important case in that it is the first major case dealing with prayer in school. From the details you can see here, a state law said that students in New York had to begin each day with a prayer written by the state government. The Supreme Court ruled 6-1 that we needed to have separation of church and state. You cannot have the government and religion mixing. This is part of the First Amendment, and it shows how the Supreme Court uses our amendments to make decisions that protect our rights. This was the Supreme Court saying that religion and government should not mix, so we push a national religion on the people. The next case here is Miranda versus Arizona. You have heard this case before if you've ever watched a television show with police saying you have the right to remain silent. In this case, a man was arrested and was not told he had the right to remain silent, and he had the right to a lawyer, and therefore he gave information to the police that led to his being found guilty. He later sued and said he should be given that right. The Supreme Court agreed and said that you had to be given your rights. These are now called the Miranda rights because of this case. It was a close decision because some justices felt this made the job of police harder, unnecessarily harder, but other justices found that it protected your rights. And ultimately, it makes the police do a better job because they know they have to protect your rights. Therefore, they're going to do everything they can to do things within the law to bring the right people to justice. This decision here protects your rights under the Fifth Amendment and makes the police do a good job. The final case is Tinker versus Des Moines. This is an important case for students, as it said that your free speech does not end at the schoolhouse door. A brother and sister were protesting the Vietnam War. They wore black armbands to school. The school passed a school rule that said you could not wear black armbands to school just to make sure these students did not protest. They were suspended. The students sued and said their rights had been violated. The Supreme Court agreed. and said that if students' free speech does not cause a disruption at school, they should be allowed free speech. This case gave many rights to students that you still have today. So that's the end of our notes on judicial review and other landmark Supreme Court cases. Use these notes to complete your assignment on Google Docs.